Alors, bonjour à toutes et à tous. Merci d'être là pour cette deuxième session de notre séminaire commun Collège de France EPHE dédié cette année au Livre des Rois de Ferdowsi et aux épopées sistaniennes. La semaine dernière, nous avons eu une très bonne introduction sur le caractère central de Rostam à travers les textes, les peintures et les manuscrits en Iran et en Asie centrale. Aujourd'hui, nous allons parler plutôt des épopées du Sistan, avec encore une fois le caractère de Rostam, mais aussi sa descendance, la saga des Sistans, des Sistani à travers les fils et les petits-fils et même les arrière-petits-fils de Rostam, et notamment avec les interpolations que ces textes ont pu avoir dans le corps du Shāhnāma de Ferdowsi à proprement parler. Et nous avons la chance de recevoir aujourd'hui une spécialiste de la question, Madame Gabrielle Berg, qui est professeure de littérature persane, de langue et de littérature persane à l'Université de Leyde. Et en réalité, on peut dire que c'est à elle qu'on doit le regain d'intérêt pour ces épopées qu'on a appelées d'abord secondaires, les épopées du Sistan, mais on sait qu'elles ne sont absolument pas secondaires, elles sont même tout à fait centrales par rapport au cycle épique de l'Iran ancien. Elle a donc signé de nombreux articles sur la question, dirigé des travaux, des projets, des thèses publiées sur ce sujet qui permettent justement à ce thème de revenir sur le devant de la scène. Donc c'est non seulement une spécialiste du Shāhnāma de Ferdowsi, une spécialiste mondialement reconnue, ses travaux sont très appréciés en Iran, mais c'est aussi une spécialiste du folklore de l'Asie centrale dans son ensemble, de la tradition orale. Elle a publié en 2004 un ouvrage sur la poésie des ménestrels des montagnes du Pamir, donc en centrant son approche sur la communauté ismaïli du Badakhshan. Plus récemment, en 2014, elle a coédité un ouvrage dédié à l'épopée de Barzu, un caractère dont elle va nous parler aujourd'hui, Barzu ou Barzu, selon les traditions orales des conteurs des bardes du sud de l'Ouzbékistan, la région de Boysun. Et enfin, je dois aussi signaler que Madame Berg a reçu un prix extrêmement prestigieux, le prix Vichy, de l'Organisation pour la recherche scientifique aux Pays-Bas, pour un projet très vaste sur les textes et les territoires des Turcs, l'idéologie impériale et la production culturelle en Asie centrale. Donc je lui cède à présent la parole et je la remercie pour sa présence ici.
Merci beaucoup. Et je m'excuse que cette présentation sera en anglais, mais j'espère que c'est clair, et si ce n'est pas clair, n'hésitez pas de m'indiquer. First of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Samra Azarnouch and Professor Frantz Grenet for their very kind invitation to this seminar. It's a great honor for me to be here and to speak to such an esteemed audience. I have 2 hours, which is wonderful, but at the same time also really, I'm afraid I may even have too much. I do not know. I'll try to speak slowly. I know that I very often get carried away when I speak in whichever language, which is not so very wise, of course. So please raise your hand if you think that it's really going too fast, or if you think I'm really being unclear because I'm too much into my own subject. Now, this is a vast topic, the Sistani epics in the Shāhnāma manuscript tradition, and I have chosen to speak on 2 figures in this tradition, but I'll start with quite an extensive introduction on the Shāhnāma itself. Now, perhaps that is for some of you not really very interesting, because you may already know this, but I will do it all the same. So, first of all, just a few data, just to make clear where we are. The Shāhnāma by the poet Abul Qasim Ferdowsi was composed in the year 1010, or was completed in the year 1010 AD. I use in this presentation only the Christian era dates, not to complicate things by giving too much information. It is actually a reflection, one may say, a poetic reflection of the legends and the history of the Iranian people, of Iran and the Iranian people, from creation until the coming of Islam. It is in fact a versified history of kings, and it ends with the Arab conquest and the end of the Sasanian dynasty, the end of the Sasanian Empire around 650 AD. It is composed in a specific poetic form, the Masnavi, and it is also composed in a specific poetic meter, the Mutaqarib, which has been ever since a meter for this kind of heroic epics. Now, the work is based on oral sources, one may assume, and also on older written sources. The Shāhnāma follows the line of Iranian kings, and many of those kings are entirely legendary. A substantial part of the Shāhnāma deals with the rivalry between Iran and Turan, and it is in this part that the hero Rostam plays a major role. He is the vassal of the Iranian kings, a superhuman hero, champion from the land of Sistani, which may be situated in the borderlands of present-day Iran and Afghanistan, but it's a little bit difficult to state that those places which are mentioned in the Shāhnāma are identical to the places that have the same name today, but I'll come back to that later. So a large part of today's lecture will also be connected at least to Rostam, as Dr. Azarnoush already indicated. Now, the Shāhnāma was originally meant for a dynasty that was in power during Ferdowsi's lifetime, and that was the dynasty of the Samanids, the Samanid dynasty. And they ruled from the city of Bukhara between, in the 9th and the 10th century. And Bukhara is in present-day Uzbekistan. When Ferdowsi had completed his magnum opus, the Samanids had fallen subject to their former slave soldiers, the Ghaznavids. And the Ghaznavid dynasty succeeded them and ruled over a very large part of Asia and the Middle East in the 11th and 12th century. And the most well-known of these rulers is Mahmud of Ghazna. It was to him that the Shāhnāma by Ferdowsi, or that Ferdowsi dedicated his Shāhnāma. So this is the realm of the Ghaznavid Empire, as you can see, covering a large part of the Middle East and Iran, encompassing a large part of Iran too. Now, the Shāhnāma opens with the story of the first man on earth, and that is like the Persian Adam. He is called Gayumars or Kayumars. And at this period, as the very start of the Shāhnāma, there is no word of hostility between Iran and Turan at this stage. The war hasn't started yet. Gayumars, the first king, rules in fact the entire world entirely by himself. And he is on miniature paintings, easily recognized, for he and his following are usually painted dressed in animal skins, as you can clearly see, of course, here. Now, this picture comes from a Shāhnāma we keep at the Leiden University Library, and we are very happy to have this copy. And it is a copy which was made in the time of the Timurid dynasty, and the date of the manuscript is actually dated 1437 AD. There are, of course, thousands of manuscripts of the Shāhnāma, and they have been produced over the centuries, sometimes illustrated, or I should actually say quite often illustrated, but not always. So I will show during this talk paintings from a variety of manuscripts, from let's say, the very beginning of the history of miniature painting right up until the very end. Now, this is just to give you an idea of the realm of the Timurids, and I guess you've been hearing about the Timurids last week too. Anyway, during their rule, quite a number of Shāhnāma manuscripts were produced. They are quite important for the tradition of producing Shāhnāma manuscripts. Now this manuscript I just showed a picture of the first man on earth, Gaiomaars. As I said, is at Leiden University, and this is how the cover looks like and how the opening page looks like. And I show this just to show you how a Shāhnāma manuscript looks like, especially the first page is usually has a sort of an illumination on top of it and starts with the verses which have become very famous. Bename Godavande, Jano Gerat, etc. The very first lines of the Shāhnāma. Many Shāhnāma manuscript copies do not start with an illustration of a scene of the Shāhnāma, but with an illustration of a courtly scene, a princely scene, which is not directly related to the contents of a Shāhnāma manuscript. So this frontispiece double-page painting is such a courtly scene and may reflect the court of the ruler for whom this manuscript was made. It's, as I said, not related to the contents of the Shāhnāma. Now, another picture, another painting of the very first scene of the Shāhnāma is this one, Gaiomaars enthroned. And as you can see, it's a bit of a later manuscript, 1480, coming from the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin. But I hope to show how recognizable this first scene is, since you see the animal skins, kind of paradisical setting. Now, an even richer, actually very rich painting is this one, which is a painting where you see Gaiomaars sitting on top. It's a very famous painting, actually, it's reproduced many times. We see him in a very spectacular setting, and this manuscript, or this painting, is part of a very famous royal manuscript which was produced for Shah Tahmasp, who ruled from 1524 to 1576. He was the second king of a dynasty which is called the Safavid dynasty. And they ruled over Iran from 1501 to 1722, and actually are seen as the ones who created, or forerunners of modern Iran. Now, this painting from this manuscript was made in Tabriz, in the city of Tabriz, in the northwest of present-day Iran, between 1520 and 1530. It's a very majestic and luxurious Shāhnāma, and as such it exemplifies the function of Shāhnāma manuscripts as symbols of power and royal prestige. Now, this is a detail from this same picture, this same painting. And this manuscript is known not just as the Shāhnāma Shāh Tahmasp, but also as the Shāhnāma Shāhi, meaning the royal Shāhnāma, the royal Book of Kings, a king's Book of Kings. It was commissioned by the father of Shah Tahmasp, the first king of the Safavid dynasty, Shah Ismail I. And he, in fact, proclaimed the Shia as the state religion of his newly founded empire in 1501. Now, this is a picture just not really related to the Shāhnāma at all, a picture of, or a photograph of a mural in the Chel Sultan Palace in Isfahan, and an impression of the scope of the Safavid Empire. And this is the man who commissioned this beautiful royal Shāhnāma Ismail I. This is also quite a well-known picture, well-known painting made by a Venetian painter. It is now on display in the Uffizi in Florence. Now, his son Shah Tahmasp had received this manuscript as a kind of gift, but he himself later presented this manuscript as a gift, as a diplomatic gift, to the Ottoman Sultan in the 1560s, perhaps to convey the message that the Ottomans should bear in mind the importance of the Safavids as the heirs of the Persian kingship tradition. The manuscript was kept for a very long time at the Ottoman Royal Library, but at some point in time it came to Europe, and it was dismantled in the 1970s by the art dealer Arthur Horton, and its pages were sold separately. The manuscript is therefore now dispersed, a fate that has befallen a great deal of richly illustrated Shāhnāma manuscripts. For researchers into the Shāhnāma tradition, this is actually quite a problem, because you have to travel a lot in order to see many different pages of the Shāhnāma. Well, aside from the question that it is a great shame that such a beautiful manuscript, which had been in existence for such a long time, is now, well, not complete anymore. Now, incidentally, a glimpse of the way the poet Ferdowsi and his contemporaries were perceived can be obtained from one of the introductory pages of this same manuscript, this same Shāhnāma Shahi, made for the Safavid ruler Shah Tahmasp. Now, on this page, we see the poet Ferdowsi and how he meets with the court poets of Ghazna. The court poets are the three bearded men who are enjoying a picnic. Ferdowsi is standing to the left. He is awaiting their verdict on the verse he composed as a conclusion to the quatrain with a difficult rhyme they challenged him to complete. The young man standing to the right, so here, is a depiction of Shah Tahmasp himself, the one for whom the manuscript copy was produced. Now, the paintings from the first man on earth, Gayumars, of which we have seen a few examples before, are illustrations of the very first episode of the Shāhnāma. And this episode belongs to what may be termed the mythical part of the Shāhnāma. The world is young and as yet undivided. Kings rule the entire world and invent useful things for mankind, such as fire. Now, fire was an invention of the second king of the world after it was created, King Hoshang, who is seen here chasing a dragon and throwing stones at him, as you can see here. The dragon is here. In this manner, he discovers fire. And this painting dates from 1300 AD and is therefore one of the earliest preserved examples of an illustrated Shāhnāma manuscript page. Now, the peacefulness of the depictions of the paradisical surroundings of the first king, Gayumars, is soon ended by the rise of evil in the world in the guise of dragons and demons. The black demon, son of the evil power Ahriman, kills Gayumars' son Siamak. Hoshang is the son of this Siamak, and he takes revenge. Here we see a detail from a painting where Hoshang, who's still wearing the animal skin clothes, is actually surrounded by demons and assisted by other animals, and he is here slaughtering the black demon as a vengeance for his father. Now, the very large part that follows in the Shāhnāma revolves for a large part around the legendary wars between the kings and warriors of Iran and Turan, when the world is no longer under the command of one king, which in itself is a wonderful story, but I can hardly sort of repeat or summarize the whole Shāhnāma in an hour. But it is in this part that the Sistani cycle and the hero Rostam are most significant. And just to give you an idea, and I hope it is not too illegible, the next slide is an overview of the timeline of the Shāhnāma, of the beginning of the Shāhnāma, that is. Now, I checked and I think it can be read, but I'm sorry for all this text on one slide. As you can see, the Sistani cycle is shown here. And this is the very first king, Gayumars, his sons, and these the first rulers. Then we get to a dragon king. And then in the third part, one may say, of course, one must bear in mind that it's not Ferdowsi who has made such a scheme. It's scholars of a later period who try to sort of get a grip on the contents of the Shāhnāma and who have produced this scheme. The Shāhnāma is organized, let's say, along the line of kings. Though the first kings are called Pishdādiyan, and the dynasty of the legendary kings is called Kayanian, the Kayanid dynasty. So these kings are legendary. We see in this period that the world, the rule over the world sort of stops, and that now, from now on, we see that the world is divided in parts. And the most important parts are Iran and Turan. And as you can perhaps also see from this scheme, is that the rulers of Turan and Iran, who will have a very long, prolonged war with each other, are actually both descendants of the same man, Faridun or Fireydun. So it's really like a war between brothers, one may say. So when this war between Turan and Iran takes place, at the same time we see suddenly appearing in the Shāhnāma a separate cycle, the cycle of Sistan, which deals with the heroes of Sistan. And in that cycle, Rostam is the main figure, the central, the pivotal figure. Here he is, and here is his grandfather, his father, and one of his sons. Now I'll come back to Rostam and to the Sistan cycle a little later. First, I'd like to jump towards the end of the Shāhnāma. As you can see on the continuation, and apologies for an even fuller slide, on the continuation of the schematical timeline of the Shāhnāma, at the very end, historical names begin to appear. It's not really at the very end, it's already here. We see Dara, we see Eskandar. Dara is actually the Achaemenid king, Dareios, and Eskandar is Alexander the Great, who plays actually a major role in the Shāhnāma as a Persian king. So he is incorporated into the Persian kingship or the Iranian line of kings. And we also see, and I'll come back to them in a moment, and I've just dealt with them only like in here, Sasanians and Parthians. It's especially the Sasanians who are really important in the Shāhnāma. It's a long line of kings, and it would be madness to give them all on a slide, so I'll just mention a few of them. Now, this picture here, again, comes from the Leiden University Library Shāhnāma manuscript copy, which dates from the Timurid period, and it is an illustration from an episode found near the end of the Shāhnāma. We are by then thousands of years further in time, and in fact in an historical era, namely in the era of the Sasanian rulers. The Sasanian dynasty ruled over Iran from 225 AD to 650, 651, 652 AD, and the Shāhnāma really covers all of the more than 25 Sasanian rulers in a part of the Shāhnāma that is often described, not by Ferdowsi himself, but by many who write about this epic, as a semi-historical part. For the Sasanian rulers, like their legendary predecessors, fight demons and fight dragons. Now this picture is of Bahram Gur, a Sasanian king who has been immortalized not only in the Shāhnāma, but also in many other examples of Persian literature. Here he is showing, I hope you can see that, how he can, with one shot by his bow and arrow, how he can tie the ear and the leg of his hunting prey, a gazelle or a onager, with one shot, with one arrow. And he was actually challenged to perform this exceptional trick of huntsmanship by his slave girl. Here she is, Azadeh, she is called in the Shāhnāma. She's a musician, she's playing harp, and she challenged him to show his talent for hunting. Another famous historical king who is extensively dealt with in the Shāhnāma is the Sasanian king Khosrow Anushirvan the Just. Now this painting, kept in the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin, and they have a wonderful collection, comes from one of the most famous manuscript copies of the Shāhnāma, the so-called Great Mongol Shāhnāma. It dates from the 1330s and was produced during the reign of the Mongol Ilkhanids in Iran. As so many rulers also after them, they adopted the Shāhnāma as an emblem of kingship and had a very large manuscript copy that was to be connected to their rule It actually connects the Mongols in this manner to a very powerful ideology of kingship. Now, this particular manuscript suffered the same fate as the Shāhnāma Shahi, about which I spoke just a few minutes ago. It fell in the hands of an art dealer in the 20th century, this time Georges de Motte, and it was not only dismantled, but also very severely damaged. And this painting here, well, that's still in good condition. It depicts King Anushirvan here sitting on his throne, and he is dictating a letter to the Khāqān of Qin, so the Emperor of China. Now, Anushirvan is an exemplary king. That's why he also has the sobriquet, the Just, Adel. And he features extensively in many mirrors for princes dating from later centuries, which take their inspiration also from the Shāhnāma. Now, perhaps already these few examples show how the Shāhnāma is a work of art, a work of literature, mythology, and history, and at the same time also a work that may serve political purposes. Since for the rulers of who commissioned manuscripts of the Shāhnāma, it actually was working as a role model, not just as entertainment. It served them, broadly speaking, as a role model. It was a symbol of power, and their own, if they had a manuscript copy made in their name, they were, as it were, became, as it were, connected to a very long-standing tradition of kingship. Now I have, which actually, the fact that so many manuscripts were produced over the centuries turns the Shāhnāma into a living epic, because each king, as it were, well, has his own stamp, his own mark, left his own mark, one may say, on the Shāhnāma manuscript tradition. So, as I said, work of art, literature, mythology, history, at the same time a political document, and also very much a tool for propaganda. I think I already indicated that there are countless manuscripts, many of which are illustrated. Now, I'm not going to show you the link to the Shāhnāma project, only if time allows. I've been working for a couple of years for a project which tries to map all the illustrations of the Shāhnāma manuscripts that are preserved in the world. So it's really an ambitious project which has many members. And it includes, involves a lot of traveling, but the idea is that the whole project one of the important aims is to actually have a kind of repository of all the existing paintings and also to link them, very importantly, to the text of the Shāhnāma. Because it's already some time ago, but let's say just a few decades back, it was common practice, as it were, that the paintings of a manuscript were studied by art historians, while the text of the Shāhnāma was studied by philologists, literary historians, and that there was somehow not really a kind of connection made between the two. Now, that is a situation that belongs to the past. But to go back to my own topic, so there are many illustrated manuscripts, and they were commissioned for rulers from the 13th century to the 19th century, at least as far as we know. Further back in time, we have no evidence of manuscripts. And as I already said, it functioned as a role model for ruling classes, not just for kings, also for others, not necessarily even for the elite, one may say, but that's something I may come back to later. It was a symbol of power, and what is important to remember is that this had to do not just with the contents, but also with the form of such a manuscript copy. The more beautiful the execution of the whole manuscript copy, the object in itself became an object of prestige. The contents were also reflecting, let's say, in various forms, ideologies, which may be useful for kings and rulers. Now, stories of the Shāhnāma, as you will have gathered, became important subjects in Persian miniature painting. Now, this brings us to a question: how to read the Shāhnāma. So this is a work of 1,000 years old, and over the centuries, the Shāhnāma has been interpreted in many different ways. In the words of, and I quote here from Julie Meissami, a scholar of Persian literature and history, and she writes, Ferdowsi's vast epic poem has inspired many, often conflicting readings. Since the 19th century in particular, it has often been read as a lament for the past glories of Iranian monarchy and as a monument to the Iranian national spirit. Less often, the poem is viewed as a work of history, although there is no doubt that Ferdowsi considered his primary purpose to be historical. Now, if we look at the historical context of the creation of the Shāhnāma, we see that it was created in a time when central power was in the process of being transferred from the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad to many different smaller dynasties who had loose ties with the capital of the Abbasids. And in the lifetime of Ferdowsi, but also later, in the time of the Mongols, for instance, we see that the Shāhnāma plays a role in the legitimizing enterprise of these new rulers who sought a connection with the past. And the Shāhnāma served as a manual for kingly ethics and was therefore also a mirror for princes. But at the same time, the princes and the rulers themselves became part of this tradition by having manuscript commissioned by having manuscripts produced in their name. And each manuscript is therefore unique and mirrors, to a certain extent, its commissioner. Now, thus, the Shāhnāma became, over the centuries, a normative text. It became subject also, as such, to change and adaptation, a truly living epic. If we look at the Shāhnāma manuscripts over the ages, we see many differences in size. Generally speaking, the Shāhnāma grew over the centuries because verses, passages, episodes, sometimes even small epics were included, interpolated in Shāhnāma manuscripts, and these seem not have to be part of the Shāhnāma before. Now, most of these epics somehow complement episodes of the Shāhnāma, and that is why they are known as secondary epics, as later epics, or as another term, and I wrote them here, so this is more or less what I'm telling you, as Persian epic cycle, which is a term, which is a bit of a more neutral term perhaps, analogous to the so-called Greek epic cycle, describing the poems surrounding and complementing the Iliad and the Odyssey of Homer. Now, many of these added epic texts belong to the so-called Sistani epics, since they deal with the heroes from Sistan, who are usually connected to Rostam, and to remain in the Greek context, the Persian Hercules. So I would like now, after this quite longish introduction, to turn to these Sistani epics and their role in the Shāhnāma manuscript tradition. But if you have at this point any questions, I would be very happy to answer them. And otherwise, I'll just continue. Well, I'm just in the hands of the organizers. I'll continue with the Barzu name. Yes, it's still okay? No questions? All right. I'll continue with the Sistani epics. Now, here is just a picture of Rostam, Raksh, and the dragon, a Mughal painting, even later, kept in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. Now, a substantial part of the Shāhnāma, as I said, deals with the heroes of Sistan, in particular Rostam, who is a central figure, especially in the large episodes on the legendary Iranian kings Kay Kavos and Kay Khosrow. Now, Ferdowsi's mastery in combining the stories of the kings of Iran with stories on the champions of Sistan no doubt greatly enhanced the success of the Shāhnāma. Stories of Rostam, the most famous hero of Sistan, certainly predate the Shāhnāma. I'm sure you've been, Professor Grenet has spoken about this, though the exact nature of this epic material is quite obscure. Ferdowsi used material from this existing cycle of stories on the heroes of Sistan for his Shāhnāma, and by doing so, he immortalized Rostam and his family. However, it appears that Ferdowsi did not include all of the epic material which was circulating at his time. Other poets, such as, for example, Asadi Tusi, the author of a Shāhnāma, I'll come back to that later, are believed, so other poets are believed to have made use of the remaining material that may have continued to circulate in order to compose new epics or to elaborate on the episodes that were part of Ferdowsi's Shāhnāma. Alternatively, poets, who often have remained anonymous, created additional stories on the basis of the Sistani epics or the Sistani stories, which were already presented in the Shāhnāma. The heroes of these epics are listed, or you can be listed in actually an incomplete genealogy of Rostam on this slide. His ancestors and his descendants and he himself have become key figures in new epics. These epics have been included, inserted, interpolated into Shāhnāma manuscripts, but they can also be found as separate works, as separate manuscripts. Some of these heroes, some of the names you see here, also figure in the Shāhnāma as we believe it was composed by Ferdowsi. But some of the heroes here are not even mentioned by Ferdowsi in his Shāhnāma, as we believe it looks like. I named just a few of the names of this genealogy here. And each name which you see here, and each name that is marked with an asterisk, actually has its own name, its own book. And more are found. Yeah, well, it's kind of an ongoing research. Now, just a few words on a number of these names, not on all of them, but to start with the first one, Gashasp. He's an ancestor of Rostam who lived before the world was divided into different regions, and he lived during the reign of the evil king Zahak, the dragon king. The epic named after him was already composed as a kind of complement to the Shāhnāma in 1066 AD. And in this rare case, the author is known by name, Asadi Tusi. But usually we do not know the author of these, well, what you may call edit epics, complementary epics. Another name I would like to draw your attention to here is one of the sons of Rostam, Faramars, who in the Shāhnāma of Ferdowsi does occur, but he has a marginal role. In his own epic, however, he stands out as a superhero. And the son of Rostam, as you can see, Rostam has quite a number of sons. Well, actually, I mentioned only 3 here. He has also daughters, too. But the most famous son of Rostam is no doubt the one that is first mentioned here, Sohrab. He is the tragic hero of one of the most loved and one of the most famous stories of the Shāhnāma. And I'll come back to him in a moment because I would like to discuss Sohrab and his son Barzu in some detail. Now, Rostam's grandfather, Sam, and his father, Zal, so Sam and Zal, they both figure in the Shāhnāma by Ferdowsi. Zal is the white-haired son of Sam, who left him in the mountains to die, because he saw his son's white hair as a bad omen. And that is actually seen on a lot of, or depicted on a lot of paintings. Zal was, when he was a baby, adopted by the Simorgh, a magical, mythical bird, a kind of phoenix, who took care of him and who later on brought him back to his father. And when he brought him back, when she brought him back to his father, she gave him a feather in case he would need help in future. Now, this painting is an illustration of a manuscript which was made for Shah Abbas I, Shah Abbas the Great, also one of the Safavid rulers of the Safavid dynasty. It was made in the middle of the 16th century. And this is actually another reproduction of the same scene. And that is something you see if you look to the miniature painting tradition in its entirety. You see that the scenes that have been illustrated are, you can sort of decide on let's say, a number of hundreds of scenes that are often illustrated, and they are also often illustrated in the same manner. So there are certain aspects or certain features that come back, whether you have a manuscript of a very early period or of a later period. There are, of course, also differences, but there are also many parallels. Now, Zal actually needed the Simorgh when his wife, Rudabe, gave birth to his formidable son, Rostam, as can be seen from this painting, which comes from the same manuscript. This story, as well as the story about Zal and how he was brought to the mountains, is actually famous part also, of the Shāhnāma of Ferdowsi. However, the story of how the young boy, Rostam, and here he is as a youngster, how the young boy Rostam slaughtered a white elephant that had been broken loose, that story cannot be found in the oldest available manuscripts of the Shāhnāma. This story can therefore be probably regarded as a later addition, even though it has, from a quite early period onwards, been inserted into Shāhnāma manuscripts. In this picture it can be seen how Rostam hits the elephant on its head with a mace. And again, this picture comes from the Leiden Shāhnāma manuscript copy. We have only one, so I show a lot of pictures from that one. Another depiction of the same scene dates from the Safavid period. There you can probably see the parallels between the two. It is produced, of course, somewhat later. I also showed depictions of Zal and Simorgh from this same manuscript that is not complete anymore, but still many of its leaves survive. Now, the story of Rostam and of other later editions, many other later editions, so the story of Rostam and the White Elephant and other later editions, can be, as I said, collectively identified as Persian epic cycle poems, which for centuries were treated as an integral part of the Shāhnāma tradition. But in the 19th century, things changed. Two things happened actually at the same time. First of all, the production of manuscripts came to an end in the 19th century. Printing techniques such as lithography had been introduced in Iran, in India, generally in the Middle East, and this was around the 1820s. Now, around the same time, from the early 19th century onwards, the wish to establish an authoritative version of the Shāhnāma arose, and a number of editions appeared, sometimes also critical editions. And those who made these editions tried to approach the original version of the Shāhnāma as it was created by Ferdowsi in the year 1010, or finished in the year 1010. He worked on it for a number of decades. And they made use by the earliest manuscripts available. Now, the problem is that the earliest manuscript available dates from 2 centuries after Ferdowsi's lifetime. It dates from 1217. So there is a gap of 2 centuries between Ferdowsi and the first manuscript. In their efforts to approach the original version of the Shāhnāma, the editors decided to discard much of the epic material that had over the centuries been added to the Shāhnāma, that had over the centuries also become part of the Shāhnāma manuscript tradition in the form of text interpolations, as I will show also later on. Now, as a result, these epic texts found no place in printed editions. They disappeared from sight, as it were driven into obscurity. Now, the history of editing the Shāhnāma may be linked to British colonial rule in India. Many of the later Shāhnāma manuscripts, including many that contained extra material, originate in India, where the Shāhnāma was a popular epic, especially since the establishment of the Mughal Empire in the 16th century. The British presence in India led to an increased interest of Persian in Europe. And I'm not saying this interest in Persian was confined to Britain. Also here in France, there are editions made at an early stage, but one of the very first editions was actually made by a British captain. And that had everything to do with the fact that Persian was the administrative language of the Mughal Empire, which was conquered by the British. So when by the 19th century they had taken over power in India, many of Shāhnāma manuscripts, not just for learning language purposes, but also as a kind of curiosity, found their way to British officials and scholars, and in Britain itself and in India, and this ultimately resulted in the appearance of one of the first critical editions of the Shāhnāma by a captain, as I said, named Turner Macan. Though still far from excluding as much material as the later critical editors of the Shāhnāma, Turner Macan was aware, he was made aware, of the abundance of extra epic material in the Shāhnāmas he had under consideration, which he wanted to use for his edition. He decided to discard this additional material from the text and to put it into appendices. Later editors, amongst whom most notably Jalal Khalili Modlar, based themselves on the earliest preserved manuscripts and removed many more spurious verses and episodes. So you see a discrepancy in size between the editions, modern editions of the Shāhnāma, and the Shāhnāma as it exists in the manuscript tradition, where there are a lot more varieties, naturally perhaps. Now, the first attempts to manufacture a critical edition of the Shāhnāma coincided with the introduction of printing in Iran and in other Persianate countries, most notably India. And the critical edition of Turner Macan actually served as a model for the lithographed editions of the Shāhnāma that were disseminated in India and in Iran in the 19th and the early 20th century. So also via lithograph this became a new standard. The appearance of critical editions, together with the introduction of printing and the subsequent end of the manuscript tradition, effectively ended the distribution of epic material that had formed part of the Shāhnāma tradition for so many centuries. Now, in the remainder of this lecture, I'd like to go into more detail into two epics which have been left out then from printed editions of the Shāhnāma, critical editions, but that form part of the Shāhnāma manuscript tradition. Now, both of these two epics belong to the Persian epic cycle and can be labeled as Sistani epics too. First of all, I'd like to go into the Barzu, or the book on Barzu. If there are any questions at this point, I'd like to, if not, I'll just continue. So, a very popular poem of the Persian epic cycle, and one of the Sistani epics then, is the poem on the grandson of Rostam, who is named Barzu, or alternatively Borzu. His father, Sohrab, now here's a bit of an introduction to the story, but I'll tell it to you as well. His father, Sohrab, was actually inadvertently and tragically killed by his father, Rostam. And this is one of the most famous episodes of the Shāhnāma. I'll come back to this slide later, so it's just I want to show you this picture first. Now, this is one of the most famous episodes of the Shāhnāma, and as such, it has been illustrated really very often. The grief of Rostam, who finds out about the true identity of his adversary, but only when it's too late, as well as the sad fate of his very young son, Sohrab, who he had met only in combat, has moved audiences for centuries. And there are therefore, this is a manuscript, a picture again from the Leyde manuscript. Here we have a picture of the same scene where Rostam kills his son Sohrab without knowing that he is his son, from a Timurid manuscript painting. Here we have the same scene, but then from a Mughal painting. And here we have actually not a manuscript painting, but an oil painting, oil on canvas. This is a so-called coffee house painting, a large painting in contrast to many paintings found in manuscripts. This is very large, and this is actually from the 20th century, and coffee house paintings have that name because they had a place in coffee houses or tea houses where stories of the Shāhnāma were told by storytellers, and these storytellers, who are called naqās, they actually rephrase the material from the Shāhnāma in their own words, and sometimes insert verses from the Shāhnāma within their stories. And evening after evening, they tell these stories and can use then the oil paintings as a kind of illustrations to their stories, and they are very graphic, as you can see. Here, Rostam, who, by the way, is very recognizable too because of the Babre Bayan, as it is called, his tiger hat, is he usually wears that. And Sohrab is, the young Sohrab is lying on the ground. having just been killed, and Rostam is actually tearing his clothes apart in grief. To go back now to my list, according to the Barzu, the book of Barzu, Sohrab did die, of course, but he did die very young, but he still managed to father a son while he was on an expedition. And this expedition was to find a horse somewhere in the neighborhood of a place called Shengan. Also, Rostam and Sohrab both are credited, as it were, with expeditions on finding horses. So there are many parallels in these stories, many repetitions too. Now, Sohrab has a love affair somewhere in the north, in a place called Shengan, a love affair with a lady who is named in this tradition Shahru. Sohrab leaves her without having seen his son, though it seems that he knew or that he foresaw the pregnancy of Shahru because he gives her a ring to give to his as yet unborn son or daughter. Now, Barzu is born and grows up as a farmer and as an exceptionally strong lad. By some accident, he is, or not of course, he is noticed by the arch enemy of Rostam and the kings of Iran, Afrasiab. And Afrasiab is the great king of Turan, a kind of sorcerer king. Afrasiab sees in this young boy a very useful weapon against Rostam and takes him with him. Now, in due course, Rostam and Barzu meet each other, stand face to face in a fierce battle. And this is, of course, the grandfather of Rostam. I'm already spoiling the end. In the end, of course, is well, in contrast to the end of the story for Rostam and Sohrab, which is a very great tragedy. The story on Rostam and his grandson Barzu does not end in a tragedy, at least not immediately. It ends well. The grandfather and grandson reconcile. Why is that? That actually is everything to do with the mother of Barzu, who, in contrast to the mother of Sohrab, actually interferes with fate and intervenes when Rostam and Barzu fight. And she, just in time, rescues her son. Now, it seems evident that, and here I should move on. Here we have a in picture or painting of the intervention of Shahru during the fight of Rostam with his grandson Barzu. And here we have this mother of the young Barzu who held, I hope you can see that, a ring with a seal in her hand. And here is the horse of Rostam, who often looks like this. Now, it seems evident that many who held the Shāhnāma dear could not somehow stomach the tragic death of Sohrab, and this may have contributed to the creation of the character of Barzu, son of Sohrab, grandson of Rostam. It might well be, of course, that stories on Barzu already existed prior to the composition of the Shāhnāma, but there is no proof for this, at least not as far as I know. It can be safely assumed that a hero by the name of Barzu or Borzu does not occur in the Shāhnāma as it was composed by Ferdowsi. The oldest manuscripts do not include stories on Barzu, and it is also not in all manuscripts that we find this story. But from the 15th century onwards in particular, we see that the epic poem on Barzu, the Barzu-nāmē, is often inserted into Shāhnāma manuscripts. And apart from that, a number of independent Shāhnāma manuscripts, independent Barzu-nāmē manuscripts, can be found in libraries all over the world. And here there's a list. So it's interpolated in Shāhnāma manuscripts since the 15th century. This is the scope between 2,000, 4,000 verses. But there are many different versions. The first Barzu-nāmē is a kind of separate manuscript, so not included in a Shāhnāma manuscript. Is kept today in the King's, actually in the Cambridge University Library. It belongs to the King's College Library. The largest Barzu-nāmēs that exist date from the mid-18th century, and they are kept here in the Bibliothèque Nationale. And they are really huge, 38,000 verses, so almost as large as the Shāhnāma itself. So you can see the variety of these epics. And actually these large manuscript copies of the Barzu-name here were brought from India too. They had been commissioned by the French Orientalist Anquetil du Perron for the library of the French King Louis XV in Ahmedabad in 1760. So we have quite some details on this. And this, what I'm telling you here now on the Barzu-name deals with the shorter versions of the Barzu-name, because were I to go into the 38,000 verses, you would be flooded by names and more sons and grandsons and children. It's really a very extensive story, which, as we speak, scholars are working on. So I hope there will be some more information or translation even available soon. Now, the scope of the Shāhnāma differs in the manuscript tradition, as you can see here. When the Barzu-name is interpolated in a Shāhnāma manuscript, then usually they have between 2,000 and 4,000 lines, but when independently produced, they can have many more lines. Now, it has been proposed that the Barzu-name already deals from the 11th century and that it has been composed by someone who was named Ata'i. However, both the date of its composition and of the authorship remain a matter of debate. Although it seems quite certain now that Ata'i is probably not the poet who composed the Barzu-name. In the oldest manuscript, but only in that manuscript, the name Maulana Shamsuddin Kosaj or Kusaj is given. Now, when interpolated in Shāhnāma manuscripts, the Barzu-name can appear in different places within the storyline, so to speak. Though you might expect to find a Barzu-name, let's say, after the episode of Rostam and Sohrab, because it's a sequel, as it were, to the story of Rostam and Sohrab. Sohrab did die, but then again he fathered a son, so there is, as it were, a new chance for Rostam to make up. So you would actually expect the story there. But in most manuscripts, it is found later on, much later on, between the episode of Bijan and Manijeh, and that is actually a love story about an Iranian champion and a Turanian princess, and the story of the Yazda Roch, which is actually a series of combats between the Iranian and the Turanian champions. So that's the place where we usually, if there is an interpolation of the Barzu-name, we find it here. Now, both as a separate work and as an interpolation, the story of Barzu is presented or perceived as a continuation of the episode of Sohrab and Rostam. Meter, language, imagery, it's all comparable and follow the pattern already established in the Shāhnāma. Now, the Barzu-name, as well as other examples of Persian epic cycle poems, repeat certain motifs that can already be found in the Shāhnāma too. Most famously, the theme that follows or varies slightly upon the Shāhnāma story of Rostam and Sohrab, the hand-to-hand fight between father and son, hand-to-hand fight between other relatives that are unaware of each other's identity. However, in the later epics, or in this kind of epics, the fight does not end in a tragedy, but sees the long-lost relatives reunited. The scene in which Barzu's true descent is revealed is a repetition of the last combat between Rostam and Sohrab, with a less tragic outcome. Another difference is the mission of Barzu. He has no other mission than to defeat Rostam as a favor to Afrasiab. Unlike his father Sohrab, he was not looking for his father, nor does he seem to be very curious to find out who his father is. In contrast to Sohrab in the episode of Rostam and Sohrab, Barzu knows already that he is fighting the famous Rostam, but he doesn't know that Rostam is his grandfather. Now, the title Barzu, and I note here also the female roles, I'll come back to that in a moment, because I think the mother of Barzu has much more agency than the mother of Sohrab. But I'll give you a quote of that later. Now, the title Barzu-name covers a number of versions, and I cannot, as I already indicated, give you an idea of all the versions, and moreover, it's far too long, but they all deal somehow with the hero Barzu, naturally. The first version is how Sohrab meets Shahru in Shengan, how Barzu is born, how he becomes a warrior for Afrasiab, how he fights Rostam, almost dies, but for the intervention of his mother. Barzu then joins the camp of Rostam and King Keikavos, but eventually he dies. So that's one version. And that's the version which you can actually find very often interpolated after the story of Rostam and Sohrab. A second version, which occurs slightly more often, is not really dealing with the birth of Barzu, but it's just a young lad, Barzu, who is spotted by Afrasiab. And he invites him to be his warrior. Now Barzu fights Rostam, almost dies, but again for the intervention of his mother. He then joins the camp of Rostam, but another king, King Kekhosro, king later, actually the successor of King Keikavos. And he lives happily ever after. So these, very much in a nutshell, are the two versions of the Barzu-name as they can be found in Shāhnāma manuscripts. I should stress that. Now here we have two, in verse and English in this time, but I'll, two quotes from the, both one from the Shāhnāma and one from the Barzu-name. And we see that Tahmineh, here in white script, Tahmineh is the mother of Sohrab. She had not kept his true lineage secret, because as soon as Sohrab asked for his father, she had shown him a letter of Rostam containing 3 rubies and 3 golden seals. And Shahru actually acts in a very different manner. She keeps the ring she received from Sohrab, which was the proof of his descent, secret until she has no choice but to reveal whose son Barzu is, until the very end. Now in the Barzu-name, this act of concealing is commented upon by the composer of the work as being an act against fate. And I'll just read this first bit here. This is coming from the Shāhnāma. It's a translation by Jerome Clinton. And it says, "Your father is the Pahlavan," meaning the champion, the hero. Rostam, your ancestors are Sam and Nariman. And so it is your head can touch the sky. You are descendant from that famous line, since the first world creator made the earth. There's been no other horseman like Rostam, nor like Sam, the son of Nariman. The turning sphere does not dare brush his head. And in contrast, the same kind of scene is phrased in the Barzu-name in this way, in black here. So she told him nothing about Sohrab. She kept her heart's secret safe from him. She said to herself, if I tell him that he is the son of Sohrab, O nobleman, and that is a kind of interjection, he will leave Segnan and he will go to Iran. He will be unhappy and full of grief, like his father. Now the Barzu-name author comments upon this immediately after this passage. It is improper to deviate from God's fate, to deviate from both fate and consideration. The nobleman from an ancient family became the equal of a farmer. He's referring here, the author of the Barzu-name, to the fact that Barzu actually was a nobleman from the line of Rostam, and by keeping his descent secret, he became a farmer. Let me move on to this. The key scene, which is present in all versions of the Barzu-name, this is the scene where finally Shahru reveals the true identity of her son Barzu. And she does so when Rostam and Barzu meet in battle, and then she shows him the ring which was given to her by Sohrab. And the stone in this ring is recognized by Rostam as a part of his gift to the mother of Sohrab, Tahmineh, which Rostam gave to her for Sohrab as a token from his father. So there's a direct link, very clearly, to the Shāhnāma episode of Sohrab and Rostam. Now here's another, as you can see, it's very clear, I hope, that this Barzu-name is part of a Shāhnāma manuscript, and as such also often illustrated. So if you, let's say, leaf through a Shāhnāma manuscript which contains interpolations, it is not at all necessarily clear that this is an interpolation. That is also why many people who studied Shāhnāma manuscripts have sort of overlooked these, because if you do not, really leaf through a Shāhnāma manuscript in detail, you simply count it as another painting. And it's not, unless you read the text, immediately clear that this is from the story. Well, this is maybe now very clear, but that's not necessarily the case. For example, if you see two people fighting or something like that, it can be quite general, these paintings. So here we have a kind of depiction, a sort of an imploring Shahru, who here, very recognizable again, Rostam, and you see him almost on the verge of beheading his grandson, and she holds the ring up here in order to stop him. Now, judging by the frequent occurrence in Shāhnāma manuscripts, the story about Barzu must have been very popular. And not just in Shāhnāma manuscripts, but also in a tradition related to the Shāhnāma, and also a manuscript tradition. This story was very popular. The Shāhnāma, I'm not sure whether that, well, maybe you know, maybe you don't, appears in many forms, so also in the form of abridgments. Prose abridgments are very common of the Shāhnāma, and there is one prose abridgment that is very famous, and that is an abridgment that was made in the time of the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan, and it was made by a Tabaqol Beg, a servant of a governor of the Mughal Emperor in Ghazna in present-day Afghanistan. So he made what is called now a Tarikh Shamshir Khani, which literally means the history of Shamshir Khan, but actually is nothing more than a abridged version of the Shāhnāma. And what it does is it gives you an overview of all the stories in prose, but it's interspersed with verses that come directly from the Shāhnāma. And it is told in the introduction that this mukhtasar, this summary, as it were, this abridgment, was made because the Mughal rulers thought, some of the Mughal rulers, not necessarily all of them, but some, there was this tendency that the Shāhnāma was so long, how can we get a kind of overview in order to make use of its contents and of its educational value without having to go through the whole epic. So that is how the Tarikh Shamshir Khani, as it were, filled a kind of a gap. Now this is a copy of a manuscript copy found in the Lilly Library in Bloomington today. It has a number of illustrations, which is why I would like to bring this up. And at the right side here, we have the title page of actually the first English translation of the Shāhnāma made by James Atkinson. And why are they connected? Because the translation here presented as the translation of the Shāhnāma in English is nothing more than a translation of this abridgment. And this is just one manuscript copy of this work, and there exist very many. It has only been recently edited. And here we have a picture of the opening page of the Tarikh Shamshir Khani, so the abridgment of the prose of the Shāhnāma, of the manuscripts in the Lilly Library. And here we have the Captain James Atkinson, who was a translator of the Tarikh Shamshir Khani, which was presented as the Shāhnāma. If you look at the outline of the story of Barzu in the Tarikh Shamshir Khani, you see more or less the same story. You see that he meets Afrasiab, who is on his way to China, meets an exceptionally strong man, joins his army. In an attack on the army, Afrasiab takes prisoner two Iranian champions, Tous and Faribors. They are freed by Rostam. Then we see that the battle between Barzu and Rostam takes place. The first battle, the arm, that is one of the ways to show how strong Barzu is. The arm of Rostam is broken. Rostam cannot fight any further. He is secretly replaced by Faromars, who is a son of Rostam, and Faromars then captures Barzu. We see that now suddenly the mother of Barzu is called Shahruye, not Shahru. She leaves for Sistan to free her son. Again, she is very active in this story. And there she meets a lady musician, so-called Zanis Sazande, and with the help of this lady musician, she sets him free. This is also the story you find in the this a little bit more in detail. On the road back to Turan, they bump into Rostam. Rostam then poisons. Rostam is actually not so very much a positive figure in this story. He poisons, without good reason actually, the lady musician. And the next day, Barzu, Rostam, and their horses combat. You also very often see that the horses take part in the combat. Rostam finally overpowers Barzu, but we know this already, when he's just about to behead him, Shahryar intervenes. Oh yes, and this part I just wanted to, because this is quite short, and you also see how it works in the prose and in the poetry. So you first have a little line of the description of the story, and then you get some poetry. So I just read this to give you an idea of the flavor. So first in Persian then, مادر برزو فریاد کرد که ای رستم این جوان پسر سهراب و نبیره توست. سر او را مبر که مثل کشتن سهراب داغ خواهیش کشید. And then the verse, and then in English it says, O Rostam, this young man is the son of Sohrab and your grandson. Do not cut off his head, for you will be sorry, just as you were with Sohrab. Then the verse starts, which is actually identical, more or less, to the passages we find in the Barzunames, inserted, interpolated in Shāhnāmas. نخواهیش کشتن بدین گونه زار بترس از جهاندار پروردگار. You would not want to kill him in this sad manner. Fear for the one who holds the world, God, the creator of all. که گاهی نبیره کشی گاهی پور بهانه تو را کین ایران و تور. Now you kill your grandson, then your son. Your excuse is the war between Iran and Turan. تو را خود بدیده درون شرم نیست جهان را به نزدیک آزرم نیست. Have you no shame in your eyes? Is there no grief in this world? And then again a little piece of prose. رستم گفت دروغ میگویی. شهریار گفت من انگشتری سهراب نشانی دارم. So Rostam said, you lie. Shahryar said, I have the ring of Sohrab as a proof. برون کرد زنگشت انگشتری نگین فروزنده چون مشتری. So she got off the ring of her finger, a gem shining as Jupiter. نگه کرد رستم در آن بنگرید نگین جفت آن مهره خویش دید. Rostam looked and saw that the gem formed a part with his own. So actually again this very clear connection to the Shāhnāma and the way he has sort of handled his own son is being made here as well, of course. Now, that the conclusion is very clear. Grandson, grandfather are reunited. Rostam takes him to Sistani and to his own father, Zal. Then we see again, and I'm not going to go into that at all, sort of a story which is attached to it, a story about a sorceress, a witch called Susan. And she offers Afrasiab to help him after he lost his new champion Barzu to Rostam. Again, poor Afrasiab has nothing left. And Afrasiab, sends his own champion Pilsam with her. Susan then lures away the champions of Iran. In the end, they're all saved by Barzu, Faromaz, and Rostam. So this is a kind of extension of an extension, one may say, of which also, incidentally, separate manuscripts do exist, and one of those is here at the Bibliothèque Nationale, a Shāhnāma, a book on Susan. Now, we see in the end of the story that Kay Khosrow offers Barzu the kingdom of Hari and Ghur, both situated in present-day Afghanistan, and bestows India to Faromaz as a kind of reward. And here we have a scene from the Lilly Library manuscript copy of this prose abridgment of the Shāhnāma dating from 1835. It is the battle between Barzu and Afrasiab, which is, if you just look at the painting itself, not immediately clear who these fighting people are. But from the context, it does become clear. And you also see how prose and poetry are sort of interchanged, and it also, like, it's, as it were, announced. Here it's announced poetry, so piece of poetry here, and before that we have prose. So it's indeed quite a kind of a handy overview of the Shāhnāma, and as such, it definitely fits into the Shāhnāma manuscript tradition. And we see also that the story of Rostam and Sohrab and the Barzuname, in all its appearances, seem to be interlinked by all these tokens of identification, and also by the great emphasis which is laid on origin, on lineage, and that's really done in small details. We see constant cursory references to the past. You saw it in the poetry, you know, you are your true lineage, you're the son of that person. Nariman is mentioned, a very old forefather. So heroes of the past are important, and the attributes of the heroes of the past are also important. So now I would actually like, and I hope I haven't tired you all out, turn to a second Sistani epic, which I also find really interesting, because it does not deal with a hero, it deals with a div, with a demon. But perhaps at this point you'd like, I'm not sure, either questions or you would like a break, let me know. So, well, let me now continue with the next epic, and I won't be as extensive about this one as I was about Barzu. And that is a Shabrang, as I said, the Book of the Black Demon. Now, we saw that Rostam, that by the Barzu, the name Rostam comes up so often that it seems on the tip of my tongue. We saw that the Barzu was connected to the story of Rostam and Sohrab. Now, the Shabrang is in a very different way also related to a Shāhnāma story, obviously. And that is to a very famous story, to another famous story, which deals with Rostam too, but it's found in Ferdowsi Shāhnāma a bit before, and it is the famous episode of the Haft Khan, or the 7 trials, or the 7 labors of Rostam. And that episode takes place in, the episode that is called the War of Mazandaran, Jang Mazandaran. And the land called Mazandaran in the Shāhnāma is the land which is traditionally ruled by demons and their consorts. And it is probably not identical to the present-day province in Iran, which is situated along the coast of the Caspian, but it is an enigmatic land, which is situated east from Iran and may be located even in India, though it is also being identified with other areas. So there is really, I find it quite interesting to look into the geography of the Shāhnāma, but again, that's a bit of a sideline. Now, in the Shāhnāma episode of the War of Mazandaran, King Kayqavos, who had just been proclaimed king of Iran, unwisely plans to conquer the king of Mazandaran and his land, while he knows this is a dangerous land. His advisor, Zal, the father of Rostam, has told him that this is a land full of wizard demons. And it is protected by magic, and it is in the power of sorcerers. And it's a land that cannot be defeated by the sword, and cannot be obtained by treasure or by knowledge. It's a land also that no one deems auspicious to visit. Now, Kayqavos very much follows his own mind. In fact, most of the Iranian kings do. That is why they need a figure such as Rostam. And he doesn't follow this advice and goes to Mazandaran. Now, as foreseen by Zal, King Kayqavos ends up as a captive of the king of Mazandaran, who blinds him, the king, and also the warriors that had accompanied him. He ends up then in the king of Mazandaran being like the white div. And he sends a message. Kayqavos manages to send a message to Zal, and Zal sends his son Rostam to rescue the king. Now, this is like sort of the way the story is introduced, but what is important about this story is that it gives the Ferdowsi ample chance to describe this heroic tour of Rostam to Mazandaran, and that is the Haft Khan, so the 7 trials. You just compare to the 7, to Hercules actually. So it's really very comparable, I would say, and a topos in epics. Now Rostam takes the shortcut, a dangerous shortcut, and he, along the route, he performs these trials. His first trial is not so heroic, one may say, because it's actually done for him by his horse Raksh, who kills a marauding lion, as it is called, and that can be seen here very clearly. Here we have Rostam, and now I'm going to look at this here, because here he is indeed, it looks a bit reddish, but the horse of Rostam, Raksh, here kills this marauding lion while Rostam is fast asleep. Now, this, I'm not going to go into all the 7 trials, but apart from the story of Rostam and Sohrab, the story of Rostam and the 7 trials those stories are the ones that are most frequently illustrated. That is something which we can clearly see from the results of these Shāhnāma projects, which tries to map all the illustrations, especially the last trial of Rostam, when he finally beats the white div of Mazandaran. That is illustrated hundreds and hundreds of times in most manuscripts that are illustrated. You find that illustration. Of course, the 7 trials form an ideal topic to illustrate. Now, the 3rd trial, I'm just giving you a few examples, is a late 17th century mural painting of the 3rd trial, where Rostam kills a dragon, again helped by his horse. And the 7th trial is depicted, as I said, quite often, here in a very early example of the 14th century. But before he finally manages to kill the white demon, he captures a figure that plays a role in the Shabrang, about which I'm going to talk a bit more. And he captures someone that is called Aulad. And Aulad is a man from Mazandaran who will serve him as a guide during the last 2 trials, and he finally manages also he's a kind of help. And as a reward, Aulad is, after Rostam finishes the white demon, Aulad is given rule over Mazandaran, and he becomes a vassal of King Qaboos. But that is the end of the episode on the war of Mazandaran in the Shāhnāma of Ferdowsi. So here we have the same picture from the Leiden University Library, and what you see here is this same man, Aulad, tied to a tree for his own safety. That is the way he is very often represented in paintings of Rostam and the white demon. And you're right, here again, he has a bit of a red hair. And here we have another depiction, yet very graphic one, of a later one also of the white demon. And here again, a modern one, an oil painting, where we see, and that is, I think that is also an interesting development, that Aulad suddenly turned into a demon himself as well. That you see sort of already in later manuscripts happening, but that's something which does not really relate to my story. Now in the Shāhnāma, it is when Aulad is given rule over Mazandaran in name of Kay Qaboos, that's the end of the story. But in a very limited number of Shāhnāma manuscripts, there is a continuation of these 7 trials, Haftgaan, in the form of an interpolation. Now this is a kind of follow-up. So in the Shāhnāma, it's Rostam who slays the white demon, last of the 7 trials. But in the epic composed as a kind of sequel, the Shabrang, literally the book on Shabrang, meaning the one who has the color of the night, the white demon appears to have fathered his son, again, the fathering of a son, and the story, as it were, continues. It's found as an interpolation only in a few Shāhnāma manuscripts. It's once as an independent work, and this independent manuscript is in the Leiden University Library, which is the reason why I've been working on it. It's attributed to a scholar, Azad Sarv, who was governor of Marv, but that's probably an attribution which does not really make much sense. And you can see how many verses it counts. So again, a little between 2,000 and, let's say, 3,000 verses. The Shabrang opens with a very brief recapitulation of the concluding part of the 7 trials. So usually in all Shāhnāma stories, and I couldn't go into this, of course, you find pieces of moral advice introducing the stories. And that's also the case in these epics that have been added to the Shāhnāma. Certainly in the Shabrang, there's quite some moral advice, andars, and that this andars, this moral advice, deals with greed. So it deals with it warns against oz or greed. Now, the story that further that develops can be summarized as follows. So Aulad becomes king of Mazandaran. Shabrang seeks revenge. He defeats Aulad. He makes his mother, Magyar, queen of Mazandaran, builds an army of demons and fights Rostam and his warriors. And in the end, we see that Rostam is victorious, though Shabrang is not killed, which in itself gives, of course, room for, again, more stories, which you find specifically. I have not, to some extent, you see Shabrang coming back in some versions of the Varamarsname, but in the oral traditions, Shabrang certainly returns, and the story goes on. Now, part of this battle between Rostam and the army of Shabrang takes place near the city of Ctesiphon, so Baghdad, at least in the Shabrang-name. And this is a very short outline because many champions and demons come up in the story until, in the end, then Shabrang is almost defeated. So this is, in short, the story. Now, because I try to not to be too long about this. Now, in this case, because we do not have that many manuscripts, it's possible to give you a kind of idea where it can be found and when and where. So you would expect, let's say, an interpolation of the Shabrang-name immediately, obviously, after this Haftgaan. But that is actually not the case, and why is that? We do not really, we cannot really say that because we have a little bit of a problem. Two of the manuscripts in which a Shabrang-name is found are in disorder. Many manuscripts of the Shāhnāma are, by the way, not necessarily in a good condition. So you see all the you have to, let's say, make an order yourself. They're not paginated. There is a very famous Shāhnāma dating from 1830, 1833, so at the very end of the manuscript tradition, 19th century manuscript, that is a kind of culmination of the Shāhnāma, one may say, because it has a lot of interpolations. There we find a Shabrang-name interpolation after the following war. So we have first the war between or the war of Mazandaran, and then we have the war of Hamavaran. And you would expect the Shabrang-name following immediately the war of Mazandaran and not following the next war. But we find it actually in that position. And I find it striking that these interpolations, you sort of seem to expect something and then it doesn't happen. But then again, that's something, that's what it is. The 17th century, the oldest actually manuscript of the Shabrang-name is a separate manuscript. The oldest version is a separate independent manuscript, which is a Shabrang-name combined with a Varamarsname. So this is the situation we have. And in the manuscript tradition, it's very clear that the Shabrang-name is connected to the Varamarsname, because both in this separate manuscript, as well as in this large manuscript with many interpolations, the book on Varamars immediately follows the Shabrang-name. It may be even a kind of prelude to the Varamarsname, because in the Shabrang-name, Varamars plays a bigger role gradually through the epic itself. And although his role can still not be compared to that of his father Rostam, who plays such a big role too in the Shabrang-name. And in the Varamarsname, he's clearly the main hero. Now, this is just some pictures of the Shabrang-name in the Leyde University Library. So it's a small book, written the verse in a kind of diagonal way. We know the copyists. We unfortunately have no year, but we do have an owner's mark, which is quite early, for at least for Shabrang-name. If you compare it to other Shabrang-name examples, it's 1652 AD. It is from the library of a Dutch Orientalist, Johannes Wilmet, and it came via another Orientalist from the private collection of one of the more famous Dutch Orientalists, Jacob Golius, who lived at the end of the 16th century and who collected, or who had a large manuscript collection that was collected via his agent, Levinus Barner, in the Ottoman Empire in Istanbul. So this provenance proves that this manuscript, is at least, of that age, at least, let's say, around 1650. Now, the inside cover can be seen here, and we have here also an old, the writing, I suppose, of one of the Orientalists, the Hikayat de Shabrang, so the story on Shabrang. Here we have the name of Wilmet, and here the Historia rerum gestarum regis Shabrang, so a Persian poem. So, and again, more in close detail. So, and here we have an example. I just wanted to show you how it looks in manuscript tradition. An example of the Shabrang in a Shāhnāma that comes from India. And here you see how the beginning of the story is, well, if you read Persian, Dastani Shabrang div dar Mazandaran, the story of Shabrang, the demon in Mazandaran. So interpolated, well, as it were, a part of the Shāhnāma manuscript itself. So here, too, from this same manuscript, we have even a picture of the black demon. The problem is that this is a picture glued over, a painting glued over, as you can see, the text. The text under the picture is from the Shabrang, and this black demon seems to be part not of the Shabrang itself, but of the Pharaoh that follows. So this is probably the one who did this, thought like, here we have a black demon, let's just glue this picture into this position. So you see also what's happening to manuscripts. It's just like, as if it's just a kind of, the way they have been treated is not necessarily always, shows the way they were used. This is a color picture, a late picture, as you can see. Probably this is a 19th century manuscript. I think it's even dated, but I have it here, the date of this manuscript, sorry. So it's dated 1797, a Qajar manuscript, sorry for this. This is the preserved in Mashhad, in the Astana Quds library. Here we see, and that is also how he is described in the text, Shabrang painted with a trunk and with tusks. And here we have Rostam with the black beard, and also you see, just because of your question, you see a little bit more of a, let's say, less Asiatic representation of the figures. But you also see that these later, at least if you judge this painting, if you'd like to judge that painting, that the generally speaking, the illustrations from the Qajar period are not as refined, one may say, as the illustrations from the Safavid or the Timurid period. But that's, again, maybe also a bit of a value judgment. Now, I'm very interested in this, and my colleague Marjolein van Zutphen also has written more extensively about this manuscript, which contains a Shabrang. This is a manuscript which contains so many interpolations, and it's only part of the Shāhnāma, it's not even the whole Shāhnāma. It has I wanted to show you this because you can see how it works. So you have you have the Shāhnāma at a very early stage, so already in folio 15. Then you have a Psalmnāma, a book on Psalm. You have a story about Rostam and Kuki Korzad, again an extra epic poem. Then you have and this is a description which you can find in the catalogue, a story, or maybe rather a collection of episodes on Rostam and the Babri Bayan, on the birth of Pharaoh Mars, and on Rostam and the sea monster Bat-Yareh. So these stories have not even been really dealt with in any sort of extensive manner. And another colleague of mine, Charles Melville, has been working recently on another demon, the son of Akwa Div, another famous demon from the Shāhnāma, Bargias. So we see that extra epics, as it were, resurface all the time almost. Now the Shabrang is then on folio 146a it starts. Then we immediately the Pharaoh Mars Name, and then we get again another sequel to the story of Rostam and Sohrab, now featuring the mother of Sohrab. Then we get a Barzu Name, and then also we have a Banu Koshasp Name. Banu Koshasp is a daughter of Rostam. So just to give you an example of how a Shāhnāma manuscript may look like. This is of course an example that is not found very often with so many interpolations, but it stands at the end of a tradition. Now this same manuscript, 19th century manuscript kept in the British Library, unfortunately, one may say, but this is something you see not just in late manuscripts, also in earlier manuscripts, unfortunately has many empty spaces, blank spaces. So not There is a program, of course, there is a copyist who write the texts, and then the paintings are added by a painter. But not always this could be completed, and in this particular manuscript there are many, many blank spaces. You see also in this manuscript that the title headings for the stories are quite extensive, which is, can be quite helpful. Here we see, at least the Persians, Adane Shabrang, Pesar Sipidiv, از مادر و پرسیدن نژاد خود از او و گفتن مادر که تو پسر دیو سپیدی و آمدن به مازندران. So it's the birth of Shabrang, the son of the white div, from his mother, and his asking about his origin, and the saying of the mother that you are the son of the white div, and then his coming to Mazandaran. So it's the title headings read, as it were, as stories. Now we have and unfortunately this is a very poor reproduction, so I don't have anything better. I've seen the manuscript, but I have no access to a better picture. So it's also quite an unclear image, but you see that, well, there are some illustrations actually executed, and this is a painting of the story, or belongs to the story of Shabrang. Now, before I conclude, as a last slide, I've here actually because that's also what you see in this whole tradition, that paintings and texts, at the end, not at the end, but in the Mughal period, more and more become separated. So you see scenes from which originally belonged to stories and books are also presented separately. And this is an example. So we do not really know the context of this scene. It's clearly Rostam, and it's clearly a black demon. But whether it's our Shabrang or not, that's uncertain. So but it at least is a very refined picture, I think, of a black demon and of Rostam. Now, to conclude, as Persian epic cycle poems, both the Barzu-name and the Shabrang-name follow a very clear pattern. A storyline which seems surely ended, at least in the Shāhnāma, is not really ended, and a sequel was composed. Now, the largest part of these epic sequels can be labeled as Sistani epics, since they are directly related to the Sistan cycle included by Ferdowsi in his Shāhnāma. Now, whether the added material came into existence as a result of the success of the Shāhnāma, and specifically the Sistan epic cycle, or whether they were already in existence in some form before the creation of the Shāhnāma, remains unknown. It seems certain, however, that this material owes its continued popularity to the popularity of the Shāhnāma and the way in which the Shāhnāma was handed down in the manuscript tradition. Perhaps these epics added as a sequel, were even contributed to the popularity of the Shāhnāma, also in relation to the fact that these epics feature extensively in a lively oral tradition, as I just sort of briefly discussed. Once the additional epic material was excluded from printed editions, its popularity waned. It suffered a severe setback. The epics became forgotten and neglected after having been for a long time part of the Shāhnāma tradition. For a long time, Shāhnāma scholars focused more on the origins and what was deemed to be the original version of the Shāhnāma than on its evolution and development in the manuscript tradition. Thereby, they practically denied the fact that the Shāhnāma constitutes a living tradition. Had this not been the case, had the Shāhnāma not been part of a living tradition, it would probably not have become famous as the Iranian national epic. So it's only in recent times that a renewed interest in the added epic material has resulted in detailed research into the nature and the background of the variant forms of this material. And that is a development, I think, that does justice to the Shāhnāma tradition as a whole. So thank you very much for your patience and attention.